The history we all know seems carved in stone. The War of 1812 was an epic showdown between two giants, Emperor Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte. France's Grand Army, having conquered all of Europe, invades the vast expanses of the Russian Empire. A heroic defense, a scorched Moscow, the Battle of Borodino, and finally the disgraceful retreat and demise of the French troops in a frozen wasteland. This picture is familiar to everyone from their school days. It forms the basis of our national identity, celebrated in novels and captured in magnificent paintings. We don't doubt it because it seems obvious and the only correct version. But what if for a moment we set aside the familiar textbooks and look at Napoleon's own documents, his letters and orders? It is there in the primary sources that a real mystery begins. In them, you will hardly find the word Russia that we are used to. Instead, the French emperor writes about a campaign into a mysterious Tartary, about the lands of ancient Muscovy, about clashes with some kind of Asiatic hordes. It sounds like a description of a journey to a completely different, almost mythical country, not a military report on a campaign against a well-known European power. Imagine the bewilderment of a historian who discovers that a key participant in the events calls his opponent by a completely different name than the one we use today. This isn't just a stylistic quirk or a nod to archaic geography, it's a fundamental discrepancy that calls into question everything we know. If Napoleon was convinced he was fighting Tartary, then what was the Russian Empire of Alexander I in his eyes? Was it an ally, a bystander, or something else entirely? This strangeness forces us to ask the main, almost seditious question. What if our real enemy in that war was not who we are told it was? It's possible that Napoleon was not marching against the Russian Empire we know, but against another powerful state that was later simply erased from political maps and wiped from the pages of history. Perhaps the familiar narrative of the War of 1812 is just a convenient screen hiding a much more complex and grandiose drama, the true story of a civilization we lost. The answers to these questions are hidden not in rewritten chronicles, but in the silent witnesses of that era in the artifacts that have survived to our days and hold the key to unraveling this great mystery. And the first such key is an old medal that is completely inexplicable from the point of view of official history. To avoid making baseless claims, let's start our investigation with one specific tangible object that anyone can find on the website of the Russian State Library. In 1912, the entire empire lavishly celebrated the centenary of the victory in the Patriotic War. It was a time of patriotic fervor, the erection of monuments, and the release of numerous commemorative artifacts designed to forever fix the great feat of their ancestors in the national memory. And here among these solemn exhibits, we find one absolutely incredible item, a commemorative medal, or as it's called, a plate. On its front side, the profiles of two emperors are minted, Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte. But look at how they are depicted. They are not opposing each other as mortal enemies in a decisive battle. No, they look at each other calmly with dignity, almost like equal allies or partners engaged in an important dialogue. There is not a hint of hatred or contempt in their images that should accompany the depiction of an aggressor and his victim. This is a scene of parody of mutual respect between two great rulers of their era. This image alone is slightly bewildering, but turn the medal over and bewilderment gives way to genuine shock. On the reverse side is an inscription that completely overturns our understanding of that war. It reads, "In unity there is strength." And further, the providence of God, the firmness of the monarch, love for the motherland and the people. Let's pause for a moment and think about this. In unity, there is strength. This phrase is placed on a commemorative token dedicated to a war described to us as the most bloody clash of civilizations. Unity with whom? With the very man whose army, according to the official version, brought untold disasters and burned the ancient capital? How can a symbol of unity be placed next to the portraits of two emperors who we are assured were mortal enemies? This isn't just an oddity, it's a logical paradox. Imagine if in honor of the end of another great war, a medal was issued with the image of two opposing leaders and the motto "Together we are strong." It seems absurd, unthinkable. Commemorative signs are created to reinforce a certain version of events, not to contradict it. This medal doesn't just contradict, it screams that the official history is, to put it mildly, incomplete. It seems to hint at some kind of alliance, a common goal that united the two monarchs. But what goal and against whom then was this unity directed? One could dismiss this as the whim of a medalist or some symbol of post-war reconciliation. But the motto speaks not of reconciliation after hostility, but of a strength that is born precisely in unity. This implies a joint action, not forgiveness. This artifact is not just a souvenir. It is an official product issued for the centenary anniversary and therefore approved at the highest level. And it presents us with a choice. Either our ancestors 100 years ago had absolutely no understanding of the events they were celebrating, or we today are missing something very important. Perhaps this medal is just a coincidence, a strange anomaly, a single case that proves nothing. But what if it's not? What if this is just the first clue sticking out from under a thick layer of rewritten history? What if there are many more artifacts that call the official version into question? The suspicion that the medal with the motto about unity is not a random anomaly finds powerful confirmation as soon as one delves deeper into the archives. If we turn to an old book called Monuments and Medals in memory of the combat feats of the Russian army, we will find a whole section dedicated to the centenary of the war. And there, among the descriptions of dozens of award badges, we find even more astonishing examples that completely shatter the familiar picture of the world. Here, for example, is medal number 7. On its obverse is the profile of Napoleon in his famous bicorn hat and uniform. And on the reverse, an image of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the main symbol of gratitude for the deliverance from the invasion, with the inscription Moscow and the dates 1812, 1912. Think about it. On one side of the medal is the face of the man considered the cause of the city's destruction, and on the other, the cathedral built in honor of the victory over him. It's like putting a portrait of a firefighter and an arsonist on the same coin. The logic here is completely absent, unless we are missing some important detail that connects these two images. But that's not all. The description of medal number 9 adds even more mysteries. On the obverse again is the profile of Napoleon turned to the right, and next to it, the inscription Napoleon Rex. And here lies an incredible detail. All the letters in the inscription are Latin except for one, a distinct Russian letter P. On the reverse, the concise phrase in memory, a star, and the dates 1812, 1912. Why was this strange mix of alphabets necessary? It cannot be a mistake by the engraver on an official commemorative token. It is a clear sign, a deliberate emphasis that must have been understood by contemporaries. What did it mean? The question is no longer about one strange medal. We are seeing a whole series of official commemorative tokens issued in the Russian Empire on which the Emperor of France is depicted not as a defeated enemy, but as a central heroic figure worthy of memory and respect. Why would Russia and the Russian language mint medals in honor of a man who, according to the official legend, was the Antichrist, the Corsican monster, and the greatest enemy of the fatherland? Commemorative tokens are created to glorify one's own heroes and immortalize one's own victories. Here we see the glorification of the leader of the enemy army, and this paradox extends far beyond numismatics. If we turn to the literature and memoirs of the 19th century, to the poems of Pushkin, Lermontov, and the diaries of participants in those events, we will find another discovery. The image of Napoleon is not demonized there at all. In these texts, you will find almost no traces of burning hatred or contempt for the French emperor. On the contrary, through the lines, one can feel respect for his genius, admiration for the scale of his personality, and recognition of his historical role. He is perceived not as a barbarian destroyer, but as a tragic, grandiose figure of world scale. One gets the impression that someone later, already in the 20th century, deliberately rewrote history, simplifying it to a primitive US versus them scheme, turning the real and complex Napoleon into a convenient symbol of an absolute enemy necessary for a new ideological worldview. But if his contemporaries did not see him as a monster, if medals were minted in his honor, if his image on commemorative tokens was juxtaposed with symbols of unity, then the entire official history of the war begins to fall apart. And the main question that arises from this contradiction is if they were not irreconcilable enemies, but maintained complex yet quite respectful relations? Then who gave the order to burn Moscow? And against whom was the United Army of Europe, which entered the borders of the mysterious Muscovy, actually fighting? Perhaps the answer lies not only in official symbols, but also in the personal belongings that connected the two emperors and their generals. If official awards cast from cold metal can lie, or at least not tell the whole story, then perhaps the truth should be sought in more personal items, in objects that hold the warmth of their owner's hands. And such witnesses exist. To find them, we need to go back to 1912 to that same grandiose exhibition in Moscow dedicated to the centenary of the war. Fortunately, a detailed catalog of it has survived. The brief overview of the exhibition, which thoroughly describes the exhibits presented in each hall, and reading this document can capture the imagination more than any fiction. Let's mentally transport ourselves to the halls dedicated to the events of 1813 to 1815. That is the period after the expulsion of the Grand Army. On the middle shelf of one of the stands, as the catalog dispassionately informs us, lay a completely incredible exhibit. It was Napoleon Bonaparte's personal saber. But the most striking thing is not the fact of its existence, but to whom it was given. The saber was received not by just anyone, but by Count Pavel Andrei Shuvalov, a Russian general, a hero of the War of 1812. But how and why did the personal weapon of the Emperor of France end up with a Russian general? Perhaps it was a trophy taken in battle. The catalog provides an exhaustive and stunning answer. The description specifies that it was General Shuvalov who accompanied Napoleon to his first exile on the island of Elba. Stop and realize the full depth of this fact. A Russian general who had just participated in a war against France does not simply escort a defeated enemy, but accompanies him. And as a token of gratitude for this accompaniment, Napoleon gives him his personal saber. A weapon for a military leader of that era is not just a tool, it is a symbol of his honor, his power, his soul. You don't give such a gift to your jailer. You give such a gift to an equal, a person you trust, whom you respect, to whom you are grateful for a service rendered with dignity. This gesture completely destroys the myth of irreconcilable enmity. This is a scenario in which one ally ensures the safety of another during a difficult stage of his journey. There is no other way to explain this gift. But if you think this is the most shocking detail from the exhibition catalog, you are mistaken. There nearby another exhibit is mentioned that testifies not just to mutual respect, but to direct military cooperation. Samples of French army uniforms were transferred to the Museum of the War of 1812 from the Quartermaster's Museum, and the description states in black and white that these samples were personally offered by Napoleon to Alexander I for a more ceremonial appearance of the Russian army. In particular, an example of a cassock uniform designed according to Napoleon's model is cited. This is direct and irrefutable proof. The leaders of two warring armies are discussing uniform design. The Emperor of France is helping his enemy make his army more beautiful and modern. This completely contradicts the common belief that the uniforms of the Russian and French armies were very different and were the main visual marker of friend or foe. On the contrary, according to this document, the uniforms were almost identical, designed with the participation of the same person. This indicates that the armies were possibly viewed not as opposing forces, but as different parts of a single whole that were supposed to look harmonious. A personal gift in the form of a saber and the joint development of military uniforms are no longer just strange artifacts. They are clues pointing to the existence of an alliance hidden behind the screen of an official war. If the emperors and their generals collaborated so closely, then what is hidden behind all these magnificent monuments of victory that are scattered throughout the country? If the war was just a performance, then who was actually defeated? Perhaps the answer is encrypted in these monuments themselves, in their most unexpected details. Personal belongings and uniforms could be hidden away in museum storerooms, but the evidence of the supposed alliance was in plain sight, cast in bronze and carved in granite.